Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. I'm gonna. So here it is. So we just had a statement that mentioned how Lot chose this area around Sodom for his flocks, etc., because it was well watered, etc. And we also read how these people around Sodom were extremely wicked. And at the very next sentence we say, Vashem Amar El Avram. So it sounds like here, okay, the Hashem said to Abram, Acharehi pared lot me'imo, after Lot had separated from him. Now, it almost sounds like it means, and the Lord had said to Abraham after Lot had separated from him, Sana enecha, cast your eyes, ur-a, and see, min hamakom asher atasham, from the place where you are, Tzafona, north, Venegba, south, Vakedma, Vayama, east and west. And I'll do the next sentence as well. Ki et kol haaretz, because the entire land. So it would have included what Lot had chosen, right? But God is saying to Abram, the entire land, asher ata ro'el lecha etnena, which you see, I will give to you, ulazaracha adolam, and to your seed in perpetuity, forever, which of course is a statement that in some ways, according to the Bible and according to the Torah, would give title, and I think title is too strong a word. To give here does not necessarily mean ownership in the final sense. It could also mean give for use, right? For eternity. In other words, that the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel is eternal. And there are other reasons as well for why this may in fact be the case. Does it mean that there are other people, etc., the problems we're having right now? I think it leaves open that particular question. I think there are other issues that impinge on this, and that taking a narrow view of this, as you can see, leads to great, great sadness and death, etc., etc. But I'm not going to go heavily into that right now. I think I've talked about it a little bit before, but today I want to go on with the text. So, so here we go. There's the sentence, Hashem Amar, etc. Right? The Lord either said or had said, etc. Amar Rabbi Elazar, said Rabbi Elazar, Mikililatan shel Rishanim, from the curse of the wicked, from the way the wicked are cursed, Ata lamed bracha letzadikim. You learn a blessing for the righteous, right? In other words, we're going to learn exactly. Torah Tamim is going, again, one of these passages that are somewhat arcane, and Torah Tamim is going to help us understand better what's going on really here. What is Rabbi Elazar really trying to get across? Shenemar, how do we know this? V'anshei Sodom ra'im v'chata'im. We had the sentence that talked about how the men of Sodom were evil and wicked and sinful. Uchtiv batre, and immediately afterwards we read the next verse. V'Hashem amar el Avram, excuse me. The Lord said to Abram, etc. Sana enecha, cast your eyes, or and see, etc. Ki et kol haaretz asher ata ro'eh lecha etnena, because all the land which you behold, I'm going to give to you, etc., etc. So we've got the one statement and the other statement. This is from Tractate Yoma that deals with Yom HaKippurim. So now let's take a look. Lefi Reish Rashi, right? So he says, according to Rashi, and I believe the Rashi is in the passage in Yoma that he's referring to, right? Heve habiur. So he explains, the explanation is, B'makom shakadosh baruch hu mekalel et harashaim, that in the place where the Holy One, blessed be He, curses the wicked, sham hu mevarech et hatzadikim. At that same place, this is what it's sounding like right there, sham, there, He blesses the righteous. Ukvar Heir HaMaharsha. We've mentioned the Maharsha before. Major commentary found in the back part of the Gemara. So he says, and the Maharsha has already explained she'ein ha'ma'amar sovel perusho, that the actual statement itself is not able to bear its explanation. I believe. Okay, so. Uh, I'll go on. He says why? Kimahu pirush halashon ata lamed. Okay, so he says what, in other words, in Rashi's explanation of the language, what do you learn? What are you inferring when you look at the first part? So I think I don't know if what he's saying, if the Maharsha also is concerned. It sounds to me like what he's saying is you don't see the connection between the one and the other. In other words, in simply saying wherever God curses the wicked, there he blesses the righteous, doesn't sound like the way in which Rabbi Eliezer, excuse me, sure, Rabbi Elazar had said. He says, from the curse of the wicked, you infer the blessing for the righteous. That isn't what it's sounding like. Rashi's explanation does not seem to be saying that, doesn't seem to be explaining that, right? He simply says you find the one where the other is. That's not an inference. All right, so going on. The Iyen Sham, he says, Torah Tamima goes on to say, and look there, examine it in the Marsha. Herich, that where he went into length, he went into a lengthy explanation, upiresh ba'ofan acher, and he explains this particular statement in another way. All right, so haven't looked at it, didn't see it, but just take Torah Tamima's word for it for the time being. V'gam perusho. So obviously Torah Tamima has examined the Maharsha, and he says his explanation as well. Eino mitkabel berechava. He says it's not easy to accept his argument, his explanation either. It isn't. It doesn't flow very well. Rechava sort of means wide. In other words, that it's comfortable. It's not so comfortable explanation. Kafei shiyit ba'er lemahayan. He's not going to tell us here. Torah Tamima is not going to tell us that, all right, how. He says, but as will be clarified to one hamahayin, to one who actually examines what the Maharsha says. So you'll see. So we don't know what it is. We don't know in what sense, but we'll take Torah Tamima's word for it at the moment, right? So now he goes on with his own interpretation. He says, to me it appears, the hakavana, right, that the intention, what the statement of Rabbi Elazar is trying to say is, al pima shekatuv, he says, it could be based on what is written by Baba Batra in the tractate Baba Batra, page 118b. Here we go. The Yehoshua v'Kalev, that if we remember the story of the 12 spies and Joshua and Caleb went along with them, right? It says there in Baba Batra that Joshua and Caleb natlu chelkam shel meraglim, that they took that part that had been assigned to the other spies. In other words, we know that all the Israelites subsequently were to gain possession in the land of Israel, and basically what this is saying is that whatever area had been assigned to the other 10 spies, Joshua and Caleb, in fact, inherited. They got it from what because of what they had done, and they were cursed as a result of their basically discouraging the Jewish people from entering the land of Israel and sort of basically breaking their hearts. And they were actually killed. We read in that passage in Numbers, in Shlach Lecha, and that in fact Caleb and Joshua inherited their portion as well. Dichtiv, and how do we know this? And here, Parshat Shlach, in the portion of Shlach, it says, "V'Yoshua v'Kalev chayu min ha'anashim." So, on the simple level, it just says, "And Joshua and Caleb lived from the men." Now, in English, it is also ambiguous, right? So, on the simple level, since we're told that the 10 spies died, right? It's as if the Torah is saying, however, Joshua and Caleb survived. right? But to live from, to live off, right, can also mean they were sustained by those other people. My chayu. So he's saying, what exactly do we mean by this term chayu? Ilema, if we'd like to argue chayu mamash, right, that in fact all we mean by that is that they remained alive, right? That's what they meant, what the Hebrew means here, that they remained alive. V'hakativ, kra acharina. The point is there is another text that points that out, right? It says the 10 of them who had badmouthed the lad died. It's not very complicated to figure out that Joshua and Caleb, who disagreed with him, were the ones who didn't die, right? So why do we need another statement to tell us what we know already? This is classic drush, right? Ella, however, we need to understand that shechayu mechelkam, that what happened was they were sustained by the portion that had belonged to the 10 spies. Vehine gam bekan. So, in fact, here too, right, with Rabbi Elazar's statement, inyan habracha, the issue of the blessing, quote, quote, that is mentioned, he netinat haaretz leorka ulerachva leAvraham ulazaro. It's where God is saying to Abraham that the entire land will belong to him. In other words, what Lot had chosen to take is going to become Abraham's as well. That's the point. That is the point. Ulefize, and according to this interpretation, heve hakavana, now the intention, right, the implication is mikilalatan shel rashaim, from the fact that the wicked are cursed, in other words, right, because they were not going to be able to stay, in terms of the 10 spies, they weren't going to be able to inherit the portion that would have been given to them. Here, Lot ultimately is unable to inherit the portions of Sodom and Gomorrah in those areas that he had wanted to. All right, atalamed, you can infer bracha la tzadikim. In other words, what the wicked want to acquire, right, in their act of wickedness, actually the righteous will acquire. Klomar, that is to say, Shinatal HaKadosh Baruch Hu Chelkam Shel Rashaim, that the Holy One, blessed be He, has taken that portion of the wicked, Unatano Avraham Ulazaro, and given it to Abraham and his seed, his offspring. Vezehu Einyan. And this, in fact, is what we're talking about in this particular section here. Ya'an, because Shenit Kalalu Harishaim, because the wicked were cursed by having whatever it was that they wanted to acquire taken away from them. That was the nature of the curse with which they were cursed. Lachen nitbarech v'nitasher chelko shel Avraham. And for this reason, he was blessed. And remember, the word bracha means sufficiency, right? Plenitude, right? V'nishasher, and enriched, chelko shel Avraham, the portion of Abraham, right, was blessed and enriched. V'dok, and of course that means QED. V'iyen od, and in terms of any further thoughts about this, see further, Masha Katuv, regarding what is written, Drasha Krova le'inyan drasha zo, an interpretation that is very similar or discussing a similar issue to this particular drasha, the kaman below, eventually, if we ever get to it, but Parshat Vayera, right? Well, actually, it's the very next parsha, so it's quite possible we will, in fact, get to it. But pasuk, in a verse, the verse that says, Hamachase anim Avraham, will I cover up from Abraham? Right? What does that mean? That is a verse where God informs Abraham about the destruction of Sodom, his decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and it's as if God is consulting his heavenly court, his divine court, and saying, "Can I? Should I?" etc. And of course, he doesn't. He lets Abraham know what he is going to do, and there, by the way, is given the reason why he will not do it. And it has to do with the fact that Abraham is going to teach his offspring the ways of God, etc. Okay, so V'sham b'pasuk, and again in the verse, Ki yidativ, for I know him. This is a continuation of that verse. Leman asher yitzaveh et vanav, in order that he command his children. This is chapter 18 of Genesis, verses 17 and 19. So with God's help, we will get to that and see what Torah Tamima has to say about that. Let me look and see if we can actually manage a little bit more. Yeah, I think we can give it a try. All right. Give me a moment. Yeah, it's not too much more. So here we go. So he says, this is verse 16. Let's see where this says, right? V'samti et zaracha, I shall place your seed, ka'afar haaretz, like the dust of the earth. The pshat of this is the number, how numerous they are, right? Here we go, as you'll see, asher im yuchal ish limnot, that is to say, if a person is able to count, right, et afar haaretz, the dust of the earth. In other words, if one could count all the grains of sand that make up the dust of the earth, gam zaracha yimaneh, so your seed too can be counted. That is pretty numerous, right? Making your seed so large, God is promising Abraham that they will be uncountable. It will not be possible to actually number them. So let's take a look here at Kafar Haaretz, like the dust of the earth. Tanya. There is again, Tanya means an early source, right? Of the time of the Mishnah, prior to the year 200. Afapi, despite the fact, de ba'alma, right, that in general, dibra Torah lashon guzma, despite the fact that in general the Torah often will speak in an exaggeration. Guzma is a word that means exaggeration. That the Torah is comfortable using exaggeration as a figure of speech. There's a little footnote here. Let's take a look and see what he has to say here. Here, Kamo, so he gives examples. Shema Yisrael, this is in Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, Ata Over Hayom, today you are crossing over, La Reshet Arim Gdolot, to inherit great cities, Uvitzurot, and fortified Bashamayim in the heavens. Right. Well, obviously, those cities aren't literally in the heavens. But I think what it's saying is how magnificent and these cities were, right? How great these cities were. And that's okay. And that's in Parshat Akev in Deuteronomy. Going on, let's see what it says. Okay. Make sure we got it here. Okay. Aval, however, ma She'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But in what the Lord said, the Holy One, basically, he said to Abram, V'samti et zaracha ka'afar haaretz, I shall make your place your seed like the dust of the earth. Eino lashon guzma. It says, in this case, God was not exaggerating to Abram that his seed would be like the dust of the earth. That is not an exaggeration. This is from the Sifrei, right? The commentary on Numbers in Deuteronomy, Parshat Varim. It's organized according to the parshas of the Torah, and it's the Sifrei on Dvarim. Let's take a look. Okay. Yesh lomar, one could say, Tam hadavar, what's the reason for this matter? Shebekan eno lashon guzma. Why is it that the Sifrei is saying this is not an exaggeration? Mipnei, because the kevan hakatuv mefaresh achar kach, because afterwards scripture explains, right? Asher im yuchal ish limnot, because it goes on to say that it's talking about, says, which if a human being can count it, etc. In other words, that's how the Torah is speaking, that when it says like the dust of the earth, like the earth, it doesn't mean that literally. It's not used in an exaggerated sense, but the Torah itself says that when it's referring to the dust of the earth, it's talking about whether or not it is capable of being counted. Hare de hahekesh himamash kipshuto. So by saying that, by making that connection, we understand that when we say like the dust of the earth, we mean like the dust of the earth in terms of being able to count it. So that's straightforward. V'yein mashekatuv, and look and see what is written. Resh Parshat Dvarim, what actually is written at the beginning of the Parsha of Dvarim, of Deuteronomy, the pasuk regarding the verse Arim Gidolot U'Betzorot Bashamayim, what it says there regarding great cities and fortified in the heavens. See what it says there. So this is where we will stop today. And this time I am absolutely going to mark this in here so I know exactly where we're going to continue. And I'm also going to go up here and see if I can. All right, that was not supposed to do that. Let's see if I can do it like this. Yep. All right. So let me stop the share. And one more thing I need to do. Mark the page. Okay, now I'll stop the share. So I will tell you that another interpretation, when it says the dust of the earth, and here it's using it in a poetic sense, is just like people will tread on the dust, right? Tread on the ground, but not damage, ultimately destroy the ground. That is another way of understanding when the Torah says, like the dust of the earth. Except, of course, in the verse here, it explicitly states it can't be counted, that's the point it's making. But that also is an interpretation, a classic interpretation, that the Jewish people will, in fact, suffer oppression, but survive, but be able to make it. So any comments for the record before I stop the recording? All right. Well, in that case, I'll say farewell to our friends.